have a fairly brief period of time, so I just want to kind of hit some highlights in terms of some of the things we're doing right now related to the issue of data collection. I know some of these issues have come up even at the last breakouts about what the significance is and importance of gathering information and how that relates to efforts to put in place and implement stewardship programs. So just a few things to touch on would be that one is, and I think this point came up too, is why do we need this information? What's the purpose of it? What value is it? And what's the benefit of gathering the information? Touch a little bit on how this relates to the current strategy the FDA is undergoing now that relates to growth promotion use of antibiotics or certain antibiotics. Look at the fact that we do have some data, so we're not in the absence of any data. What's the sort of some of the strengths and weaknesses of that information, and perhaps what gaps do we need to try to fill, and some of the efforts that are ongoing right now, including some work that we've been doing in collaboration with our colleagues at USDA as well as CDC, and then a project that I'll talk briefly about that Craig Lewis in particular has been working on, this NIMBIOS project, which I'll talk a bit about that as well. So as far as the need for this information, certainly as we go forward with taking steps to address concerns about antibiotic resistance, it's important that we have meaningful metrics so that we can basically indicate or assess how we're doing. Are the things we're doing having the desired effect that we hope to have? And ultimately, given the underlying issue we're trying to address here is antimicrobial resistance, are the things that we're doing actually having an effect on that problem, that the underlying problem, which is resistance? Certainly, this is important in terms of trying to assess what steps we should take, as well as what the effect or impact is of policy decisions we make or stewardship programs that we put in place. Do we have a way of basically a way of assessing our progress or sort of a scorecard or report card, so to speak, as far as a feedback loop in terms of how we're doing over time? So clearly, efforts relating to being able to refine what are the steps that we need to take as far as promoting appropriate use really requires a better understanding of what is the association between use practices and resistance, so that we can understand, are there certain practices that are more problematic than others, and if so, help to hone in on where we should be making those, where we should focus our resources in terms of making changes. And then therefore, it does really require that we have looking in more of a long-term view, and I think that's a fact that we really have to sort of get our heads around as far as expectation, that this is a long-term view, that as we know, these are biological systems, oftentimes not predictable as to what we think what we're going to see, and the fact that we need to look at trends over a longer haul to really understand what effect that we're actually having on use practices, as well as what effect those changes in use practices are actually having on the underlying issue we're most concerned about, which is resistance. So really just, schematically, is this idea that we need to be able to gather information in a systematic way that we can improve our understanding as to how these use practices, or what that association is between use practices and resistance, and be able to have some way of assessing that so that we can make adjustments as we need over time, and in a variety of ways. So we're not necessarily talking about interventions or mitigations that may be regulatory in nature. They may be informing animal producers, veterinarians, and others, and again, sort of the idea of a feedback loop of understanding how we're doing over time. So really, this is important in the shorter term here. We are basically a third of the way through a 3-year plan that we implemented back in December of 2013 to essentially eliminate the use of medically important antibiotics for production purposes or growth promotion purposes. That's a plan that's focused specifically on those drugs that we consider medically important, meaning they have importance for human medical therapy, and therefore, if we're most concerned about resistance emerging in those antibiotics because of the implications for public health. And the other really important change too is to bring the remaining therapeutic use of these products under the oversight of a veterinarian. And those are two pretty significant changes to how antibiotics have been used in animal agriculture for decades. And the target is to get those changes in place by December of 2016. And so obviously there is interest as we move forward down this path of implementing those changes. What kinds of information are we going to be looking at to basically assess the impact or and implementation of those changes in actual animal agricultural settings, and what kinds of information should we be looking at? And that's I think a critical issue that we're working on right now. So kind of looking at this from different kind of components of the strategy, clearly an important first step is getting those changes made. Again, there's an inventory of about 283 products that we've identified. There's 7 classes of antimicrobial drugs that have feed and water uses of those products that are used for growth promotion, all of which are currently available over the counter. So basically the idea is by December 2016, all the growth promotion uses of those products would be eliminated, and basically the remaining uses of those products in feed or water would be under the oversight of a veterinarian. As we march down this path to December 2016, I think one thing we're trying to do is provide progress reports to the public in general of how are we doing. I think there's this, there are concerns, certainly we recognize that this by design is a voluntary strategy in the sense that we've asked pharmaceutical companies to voluntarily come into FDA and agree to make these changes. Well, once those changes are made, it's really not voluntary downstream in the sense that those products, after those changes are made, can't legally be used for growth promotion purposes anymore and would be required to be accessed and used under the oversight of a veterinarian. Clearly one measure of success, so to speak, is come December 2016, have we effectively changed all of those products? I think we're optimistic that we'll get that done. The next question, though, is once those changes are made, what impact are we having? What impact have those changes made? And that's a more challenging, longer-term view is December 2016 and beyond, what kinds of endpoints should we be looking at to assess that? And again, some information we think is relevant, some relevant information that we think we already have, but there's other information that we don't necessarily have at this point, which would be helpful to that overall process. And then even looking beyond just these, which are clearly big, important changes, looking beyond this is really in the longer term, and this more broadly goes to some of the discussions earlier today about stewardship programs. Having a good source of information, I think, is an important element of implementing stewardship programs, because then we can actually point to specific information and I think provides for a more robust and sort of verifiable stewardship program, because there's measures that can be pointed to assess its progress. So just touching on briefly, there are sources of information that exist today which are helpful and important for assessing resistance issues, including the NARMS program, which has been in place since 1996. That's an interagency collaboration, really focuses on gathering information and looking at trends on foodborne pathogens, including direct isolates that are collected from food-producing animals. So that is an important source of data. USDA has a number of survey data collection systems, including the NAMS program and their ARMS program. That is also a good source of information about a variety of information, not necessarily focused exclusively on the resistance issue, but certainly is another arena, which is another area we're looking at in collaboration with our USDA colleagues. Certainly our National Residue Program database certainly provides an indicator, maybe not necessarily of antibiotic use, but maybe more appropriately antibiotic misuse if we're seeing occurrences of drug residues. And then lastly, this ADUFA 105 reference is really meant to refer to the sales antibiotic sales and distribution data that's currently required to be collected by FDA, and FDA reports out on an annual basis, and we've been doing that on an annual basis since 2009. So one of the things in starting down this path of looking at what other information or what improvements could we make to the information we already have, we did put out an advance notice proposed rulemaking. Basically, it's just a mechanism for getting public input on an issue back in 2012. We asked for comments on, are there ways we can enhance the existing sales data we already have? I think sales data has value, but it certainly does have its limitations as well. It is essentially what the sort of total amount of drug that's going into the distribution channels doesn't necessarily represent what's actually being used at the end user, and there's limited amount of granularity of what that could tell you exactly, what drug is being used for what purpose in what animal species. So it certainly has some limitations around it, but certainly has some value. We also asked for comments on, are there ways we can better summarize that kind of sales data, which in order to make that information more useful for folks looking at that information, and also just from the perspective of public transparency. And then lastly, really, are there other sources of information, other types of information that we could collect that would be helpful to the overall issue? And so again, I think all of this information I think is important as far as making sure we have a meaningful way to assess how we're doing. So some of the things that we have done with that information that we got through public comment, recently we did reformat the sales data that we report on an annual basis. I think it was last month we put out a substantially more detailed report looking at how quantity of drugs that are being sold for food-producing animals, and provided sort of different ways in which that data could be split out. Again, that has some value, but it has limitations as to what we can conclude from it. We are also in the process now of developing some rulemaking on the issue of sales data. A significant part of that is primarily to incorporate those requirements which now exist in the law, but not necessarily in the our implementing regulations that relate to records and reports for animal drugs. So we're incorporating those requirements into those regulations, but also considering whether there's some other enhancements that can be made in terms of sort of maximizing the value of that information. So that's an effort that's ongoing as well. And then lastly, and this is what I really want to focus on a little bit more, is the antimicrobial use piece, which is a piece of information that we think is the one area where it's probably weakest in terms of having information that's really tied directly back to what's happening at the farm level in terms of antibiotic use practices at the farm level, as well as antibiotic resistance trends or resistance in bacteria of interest at the farm level. And that's an area that we think additional bolstering in that area would significantly help us in terms of putting together a set of information as far as assessing the overall issue and the progress we're making. We did establish an interagency group basically last year with FDA, USDA, and CDC, really to develop and explore some possible approaches for moving forward on some additional ways we can collect data on antibiotic use. Some of the things that group have been doing in terms of, on that front are kind of mapping out the distribution channels of antibiotics, which as it turns out is an extremely complex web in terms of how antibiotics are moved through distribution channels, which is an important factor in terms of, what points in which are practical and meaningful to sort of try to collect information at. They also looked at kind of reviewing what was out there as far as the literature, looked at what we can learn from other countries. Certainly we're not alone in this arena. Globally, this is an issue in terms of looking at what are ways in which this kind of information can be collected. So a number of countries are exploring the same issue. Some countries have put in place certain systems, so we're looking at that. And then I mentioned the NIMBIOS working group, which is really getting at trying to explore pulling to technical experts together, looking at what kind of analytical tools are available for really drawing conclusions of connecting use information with resistance and how can you best analyze that in a meaningful way. And so these are all things that this group have been working on. So clearly, as I mentioned, this is an extremely complicated issue. The NIMBIOS project really, and one of the things that came out of this effort is that really there are limited methodologies out there in terms of, to provide an analytic framework for really looking at a population level analysis of antimicrobial use and resistance. And so that is one area where we felt some work should be focused in conjunction with everything else is going on so that we have ultimately can hopefully, and it'll all sort of determine whether the science can kind of come through here and identify some possible approaches, and that would enable us to have some methods in hand that would help support efforts to in a more systematic and science risk or science-based approach for drawing conclusions from the kind of information that we hope to collect. So in that effort, we utilized this, or the group really looked to this infrastructure that this program called NIMBIOS, which is the National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis. I have to see that in writing in order to say it because I can never quite get that out. So I never even attempt to say it until it's like on the screen in front of me. But in any case, the NIMBIOS is a collaboration between the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And it basically provides a framework where proposals can be put forward on particular subjects that are really focused on modeling and sort of in mathematics as it relates to intersects with biological studies. So it seemed like this was a good program for this kind of question. And so ultimately, the way this program generally works is that it focuses on these types of questions in that arena. These are projects that generally run a 2-year course. The program really provides assistance in bringing together, identifying and bringing together experts, and this is of course experts from a variety of arenas. So it's not just government, it's academia, it's whoever's out there that would be brought together. It's not really done as a public meeting, it's really bringing a work group together of experts. The group meets 2 to 4 times or so typically over this 2-year period to really hammer out some solutions or possible solutions to an issue. So this group, a proposal was put forward, and here's the title of the proposal. This would suggest, the proposal was accepted, and so there was basically, it does provide some again the infrastructure and some funding to help bring these folks together. They had their first meeting in September to start hammering this out. And again, so that just want to point to that as being one project that's underway, trying to help with this issue. And again, this is sort of just moving on a concurrent path. Our hope is that there'll be some really helpful information coming out of this. There's a lot more detail on this. I have the link here. Basically, the full listing of who the members of the group are and all that are on the website. And while it's not they're not public meetings, there's an obligation to summarize and post on the web summaries of each of their meetings. So there should be a summary up there of the first meeting they had in September. So I think it's an exciting issue. I think that has a path that's moving forward. We're hopeful that some useful information comes out of that effort. As far as the interagency group that's been working on this on-farm use issue, I think that group has really worked well together. I think it's really critical that this really is a thing that needs to be an interagency effort. The idea was really look across, what are the systems that are out there? Are there things we can leverage in terms of data collection mechanisms that have been successful in the past? And look for ways where we can leverage those to come up with approaches that could get at the kind of information that we're looking for and try to do it in a way that is not overly disruptive or burdensome on any given party, and therefore can, hopefully in a way that can, again, piggyback or leverage systems like those we already mentioned in the NOMS program, or as an example. And so the idea here is we've mapped out some sort of basic principles of some possible ideas of how that could come together. What our thinking is to provide an opportunity for public input on those approaches. We're looking at trying to pull together some mechanism for doing that, potentially a public meeting coming up hopefully in the near future, and we hope to get some more information out on that very soon as to what that will look like, and that way we can kind of keep the ball moving and the momentum going on that, because it really is critical to the overall timeline, and we have to keep in mind that obviously if you're going to start a new data collection system, having some baseline data in hand is going to be important. So the window is starting to close here as far as at least getting something in place in time for the changes we're making in December 2016. So I think overall, just wrapping up, while we have some very useful, important information available, meaning the NARMS data, the sales data, I think a concern we have is that doesn't sufficiently provide a comprehensive view. And I think our view is that to really assess this issue in a meaningful and comprehensive way, you really need to look at multiple pieces of information. While sales data is of value and provides us an indication of what's happening, we think we need to look at more than just simply quantity of products sold in terms of what's going into distribution. We need to, so the view really is to look at multiple pieces of information, NARMS data, sales data, which we already have, good news there, but also bringing into that additional information that would give us some reflection of what's actually happening at the farm level in terms of use practices and resistance. With that sort of collection of information, we think we're in a much better position, and hopefully with some additional analytical tools coming out of the NIMBIOS project, we're in a much stronger position to be able to do more sort of comprehensive assessments of how we're doing. Again, we think this is meaningful not only from the perspective of gauging the effectiveness of the current strategy we have ongoing now to make change to the growth promotion, or eliminate growth promotion in these medically important products, but has significance more broadly just for broader efforts in terms of supporting stewardship programs, antibiotic stewardship programs, as we move forward into the future.